All right, so the last thing that I wanted to cover in this episode is the Neo-Neocons, kind of who they are and what they're up to, and this whole idea of the woke right, which many Neo-Neocons have glommed onto. So the Neo-Neocons, I would say, are exemplified by people like Douglas Murray, Konstantin Kisin, James Lindsay, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin. Those are probably the most prominent ones. And they're basically neocons. They have some superficial differences with the original neocons, hence I use the term Neo-Neocon. But in most important ways, they're basically just the next generation of neocons. And it's amazing how often, when you look into people's backgrounds a bit and, where they've gone to school and what clubs they were part of and what organizations they were part of and, what previous jobs they had and all these other things, their associations, it's amazing how often when you do a little bit of that, a lot of things become clear that otherwise might not be. If you look at the new Treasury Secretary and you just go, oh, here's this guy the president chose to run the Treasury. Must know what he's doing. Must be a good guy. He's an expert. But then you look into his background and you're like, oh, he spent a couple decades as an executive at Goldman Sachs. It's like, oh, okay, well, now I know who he's really working for, right? Look into people's backgrounds, follow the money, do all these things that people say and rarely do. And things suddenly make sense and come into focus. So, actually, long before he became famous as a critic of wokeness and unfettered immigration into Western countries, Douglas Murray was primarily known as an avowed neocon and warmonger. While he no longer likes to use that particular N-word to describe himself, Murray has never, as far as I know, repudiated any of his neocon warhawk beliefs from 2 decades or more ago. In fact, in 2007, Douglas Murray published a book titled Neoconservatism: Why We Need It. That's in 2007, near the end of the Bush administration, when virtually everybody else who wasn't a neocon themselves were running away from anything that even reminded them of neoconservatism. And again, as far as I know, Douglas Murray has never repudiated or retracted any of these things. Whether it's his book about why neoconservatism is great, or, any number of articles he wrote pushing war with Iraq back in the Bush years and so forth. So Murray was a warmonger and a propagandist for the merchants of death for decades, before he glommed onto the anti-wokeness, anti-immigrant stuff that's really made him much more famous in recent years. But here's an interesting thing about Murray's background, aside from the fact that he has 0 history degrees, and that is that he is also, along with several other prominent neocons and neo-neocons, Murray is affiliated with a think tank called the Manhattan Institute. And Murray is actually listed as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute on their website right now. Now, I didn't know much about the Manhattan Institute. I had kind of heard the name here and there over the years, but I decided to look into it since Douglas Murray is a senior fellow there. And what can this reveal about who he is and, just who he tends to pal around with and, these sorts of things. So I was interested in, what is this Manhattan Institute? Where did it come from? And I'll admit, I haven't dug into the current funding of it on a large scale. I would imagine if I did that, it would reveal even more things that would just, make everything crystal clear. But I did find a particularly interesting piece of information about the Manhattan Institute's origins. And that is this: one of the 2 men who founded the Manhattan Institute was a man named William J. Casey. Now, who's William J. Casey? Well, he's no longer with us. He died roughly 40 years ago. But William J. Casey was an American who served in the OSS, the precursor of the CIA, during World War II, and who in the 1970s had some important jobs in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and who would eventually, from 1981 to 1987, under Ronald Reagan, serve as director of the CIA. Yeah, the same job that George H.W. Bush had before he became vice president. Not at all surprisingly, William Casey was particularly tight with George H.W. Bush, who himself, of course, had been CIA director under President Ford. And Casey was the key guy in bringing Poppy Bush in as Reagan's running mate in 1980, something that was kind of surprising to a lot of people because they had had a pretty acrimonious, series of debates in the 1980 Republican primary. And Bush was very much, the more liberal, progressive Rockefeller Republican, and Reagan was, to some degree posing and to some degree legitimately more of the Goldwater kind of outsider conservative Republican. And yet Reagan, once he got the nomination, picked Bush to be his running mate. Well, William Casey, like Bush, a intelligence guy, was the key guy in bringing about this strange bedfellow situation. And then Casey himself, as I already mentioned, became director of the CIA for most of Reagan's presidency. And during Casey's tenure as CIA director under Reagan, most of the church committee reforms that had been instituted to try and rein in the CIA in the 1970s were undone. And the agency would end up with more money and power in the 1980s than it had had even before the church committee revelations in the 70s. And evidence indicates that William Casey was involved in the Iran-Contra affair. And I consider it virtually impossible that he wasn't. However, we may never know all of the details about Casey's relationship to the Iran-Contra affair because literally one day before he was going to testify at the hearings on Iran-Contra, Casey suddenly had a seizure, was hospitalized, and died within a few days. Man, that was convenient for whoever else, was involved in that thing that didn't want him saying much. Now, is it just a coincidence and Casey, just was struck down by natural causes, just happened to be right before he was about to testify about Iran-Contra? Yeah, it's possible. Lots of things are possible. Timing's a little fishy, though. Especially considering how many other examples there are of, intelligence-connected people about to be grilled in front of some committee or in some court or whatever. And then, the day before they're going to testify, they just go missing. And, a week later, their body's found in the middle of a bay somewhere or something. I mean, it's amazing how often this happens to, people who knew some stuff about the JFK assassinations or, people who knew about some shady CIA shit going down in the 60s or whatever. But yeah, I should also mention that during his life, William Casey was also a member of a super secret group known as Les Cercles, giving it a French pronunciation because I think it's the French word for circle, Les Cercles, which is actually more secretive than the Bilderberg group. And Les Cercles was, I think it still exists, definitely existed back during the Cold War. Les Cercles was a kind of right-wing foreign policy group who were hardcore Cold War hawks. It had American and European members, and they were just super hardcore Cold War hawks. Also, by the way, they strongly supported apartheid in South Africa in the 70s and 80s. Just interesting side note. And anyway, I bring all this up just to make the point that the fact that Douglas Murray is a senior fellow at a quote-unquote think tank that was founded by William J. Casey, a guy who was intelligence agency up to his eyeballs, who helped his fellow intelligence alumnus George H.W. Bush become vice president, who died under at least somewhat suspicious circumstances right before he was about to testify about the Iran-Contra affair, and who was a member of this super secret right-wing elite group of Americans and Europeans, Les Cercles. The fact that this is the guy who founded the think tank at which Douglas Murray is currently a senior fellow should raise some red flags, should kind of make you go, oh, okay, well, I see who Douglas Murray really is. By the way, neocon warmonger emeritus Bill Kristol is also affiliated with the Manhattan Institute too. So there you go. I think, if I remember right, when I was looking into this a little bit, I think Wikipedia said that Bill Kristol was on the board of the Manhattan Institute, something like this. And when I actually went to their website, it didn't have him on there as a board member, but it had another Kristol. I think it was Daniel Kristol, who I believe is Bill Kristol's son. So perhaps the Wikipedia entry hasn't been updated. If Bill Kristol was on the board of the Manhattan Institute, he seems to have retired from it, but it also seems like his son has replaced him. So there you go. Murray is a senior fellow at a think tank founded by an American CIA director with all sorts of shady shit in his past, including stuff I didn't even get into because of time, and that also, the Kristols are a big part of. That's who Douglas Murray is. Right now, the most prominent examples of Neo-Neocons, what I'm calling Neo-Neocons, that come to mind would be people like Douglas Murray, James Lindsay, Ben Shapiro, Konstantin Kisin, Dave Rubin, Bari Weiss, and Jordan Peterson. By the way, just a little side note on Jordan Peterson, because he went on Rogan's podcast, I think roughly a week after the original Smith-Murray episode. And he really revealed himself to be a full-blown Neo-Neocon at that point. Now, there had been lots of public statements he made, particularly in the last couple of years or so, that indicated this, and, the fact that I forget exactly when, but it wasn't that many years ago, Jordan Peterson signed on for some huge amount of money. I think it was some amount of tens of millions of dollars to work for Ben Shapiro's neocon media company, The Daily Wire. That already kind of, was a giant red flag. And it's unfortunate because I have to say, I really liked and I really got a lot of personal benefit out of Jordan Peterson's earlier work, when he rarely, if ever, chimed in on things like foreign policy, when most of his public communications and media and so forth were dealing with things like psychology and archetypes and mythology in the tradition of people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and when he also talked a lot about just sort of basic self-help nuts and bolts stuff, and individual psychology and self-improvement and all these sorts of things, I got a lot of value personally from listening to and taking to heart a lot of his early stuff. So to see him in recent years become increasingly fixated on issues of war and foreign policy, and doing so from such a, in my opinion, stupid and terrible and dangerous perspective, i.e. the neocon perspective, it's been very dismaying and very disappointing. By the way, I heard somewhere that Jordan Peterson had actually said that up until fairly recently, he wasn't really that well versed on war and foreign policy in general, and in particular things like the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Russo-Ukrainian war. So he went and consulted an expert to get properly briefed on these issues. And if memory serves, I believe he said that the expert that he consulted with to find out what to think about these issues was Robert fucking Kagan, one of the highest level living neocons, up there, next to Bill Kristol in the living neocon pantheon, and the husband of Victoria Nuland, who probably bears more responsibility than almost anyone else for what's happened in Ukraine since 2014. That's who Jordan Peterson went to get brought up to speed on what he should think and say about these wars and foreign policy in general. No doubt he was pointed towards Robert Kagan by Ben Shapiro and or other people at the Daily Wire. And in my mind, going to Robert Kagan to get educated on issues of war and foreign policy, especially related to Israel and Ukraine, is analogous to, let's say I didn't really have much knowledge about the past and present of racial relations and tensions and things in American society. And so I decided, well, I better go consult an expert. And I went and got schooled on these issues by Ibrahim X. Kendi. You're not exactly getting the most balanced take on these issues, let's say. And Peterson's last appearance on Rogan really showed how much he is on board with the Neo-Neocons. He kept urging Rogan to put up what he called guardrails against having anti-establishment guests on his show. On his Rogan appearance, his most recent one, Peterson also talked a lot about being very concerned about psychopaths among some of the American right-wing elements on places like social media and in podcasting. Weirdly, Peterson never seems at all interested in wanting to go looking for dangerous psychopaths where they actually are perhaps the most concentrated in our entire society, and where they really do have the means, motive, and opportunity to do large-scale damage to our civilization. Namely, amongst the politicians, bureaucrats, administrators, and enforcers who constitute the high-level personnel of our political system. Let's face it, some podcaster or some social media troll saying offensive things for less than admirable reasons isn't somebody I personally would admire or want to follow or have anything to do with. But a person like that is very unlikely and probably incapable of doing things like, I don't know, lying the American people into an unnecessary war of aggression that gets hundreds of thousands of innocent people killed. For example, some edgy podcaster or some social media troll is unlikely to do something as profoundly psychopathic and huge as, for example, conducting gain-of-function experiments on viruses, and then either accidentally releasing that virus into the population or perhaps deliberately doing so, and then using the release of that virus that they made as an excuse to try to grab absolute totalitarian power at the expense of the prosperity and the physical and mental health of countless millions of ordinary people, for whom the effects of the lockdown regime were infinitely more damaging than the Frankenvirus ever could have been. No offensive podcaster or social media troll is remotely capable of doing horrible, damaging, psychopathic things on that scale. I mean, to me, ignoring the psychopaths in our political system in order to focus on some edgy fringe elements on social media and in podcasting is like a police chief in a city with a very high murder rate deciding that, the police department really needs to focus all its energy and all of its resources on going after pickpockets and shoplifters. Most of the prominent Neo-Neocons of today can be easily connected to either Dennis Prager and kind of his organizations like Prager University, or David Horowitz and his, various think tanks and things. And those guys are kind of like the links between the older generation of original Neocons and the newer generation of what I'm calling here Neo-Neocons. And I can remember for a little while when Dave Rubin first started to become a big deal, I liked a lot of what he had to say. I certainly never agreed with him across the board about everything, but for a while he sounded pretty good, and then he would, suddenly go off the rails on certain issues and things. And then I saw or heard something about Dave Rubin being, tight with Dennis Prager and having some sort of affiliation or involvement with Prager University. And I was like, okay, I know what this is. So what is a Neo-Neocon, and how are they similar to and also different from the original Neocons? So to me, perhaps the most important thing that differentiates the Neo-Neocons from the original Neocons is simply generational. The Neo-Neos are significantly younger than the original Neocons. The original Neocons, some of the earliest among them were World War II and Silent Generation, but the bulk of them, especially the bulk of them who eventually ended up, in high places of power in places like the George W. Bush administration, they were predominantly baby boomers. The Neo-Neos are late Gen Xers and early millennials. Peterson is a little bit older, so he's a bit of an exception. But other than Peterson, I believe every other name that I mentioned as a prominent Neo-Neocon is somebody who was born in either the 1970s or the 1980s. So they're roughly my age, my generation. I was born in 81. And unlike most of the original Neocons, the Neo-Neocons, again, reflecting their generational status, they're much more savvy at things like social media and what you might call new and alternative media, things like podcasting and YouTube and so forth. And other than that, most of the differences are really kind of superficial or minor, whereas the similarities are many and often very substantive. So the original Neocons, when they first started gaining some influence in the American political system in the 1970s, they'd been around, as sort of like an intellectual group for a while before that. But when they first really started to get, into some high places in some administrations and things, it was mostly around the 1970s. And a lot of them initially kind of like made a name for themselves and started to develop a following because they were chiming in on a lot of the cultural issues of the time. Most of the original Neocons, before they became Republicans, were either liberal but very hawkish on foreign policy Democrats, or they were Trotskyists. And then in the 70s, they started to chime in more and more on the cultural issues of the day. And they would often have like a story or a narrative that was very similar to a lot of the Neo-Neocons when they say things like, I didn't stop being a liberal. The people who call themselves liberal just went crazy. Or they, use the old cliche of, I didn't leave the left left me. And at the time, they would talk some about war and foreign policy, but initially they were doing a lot of stuff on domestic policy, and a lot of it had to do in various ways with opposing some of what they would portray as the excesses of the 1950s and 60s liberals, like, saying that the welfare state had gone too far, and also, being against cultural liberalism and, a lot of things that I'm not exactly a huge fan of, but that's how they kind of wormed their way into the conservative orbit, was on those issues. And in fact, in the earliest days of the Manhattan Institute, it was mostly, I believe, publishing stuff that had to do with domestic political issues, with like welfare reform and cultural issues and things. But then once they got into positions of power and influence, they focused more and more on what was really truly their number one priority the entire time, and always would be, which is war. And related to that, being very strongly Israel first. And with the Neo-Neocons, their kind of personal character arc is very often very similar. Not always, but very often. First off, many of them started off as self-identified liberals and leftists. Many of them, had been basically liberal Democrats or something close to that prior to glomming on to the new kind of Trump MAGA right. A lot of them, will say things like, I was a liberal Democrat and happy to be one like a few decades ago, but then they all became a bunch of woke lunatics. As with the original Neocons, most of the Neo-Neocons initially built a large following by chiming in on culture war issues. People like James Lindsay, Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, even Ben Shapiro. I know he's been kind of around as a major public figure for a bit longer, but even Ben Shapiro, really, like a lot of his fame and his following came from him going after the wokies. And so they built large followings and credibility by jumping into culture war issues when that was the hot button topic. This not only allowed them to build significant followings, because those were, major issues for many years and still are to some extent. And the Neo-Neocons are generally, in my opinion, good on those issues. They're generally, pretty right and have good arguments against wokeism. They just don't have equally as good arguments in favor of their real priority, which is war. And then once they kind of successfully installed themselves within very influential positions in the kind of current American right-wing milieu of Trumpism, even though they were never, ever real believers in the slogan America First, neither apparently is Trump himself, at least to a large extent. Although these Neo-Neocons I'm speaking of here, I think they're even less so than Trump, serious about any concept of America First. But once they had built, an influential following and kind of established themselves as major public figures within the new kind of Trump right wing, and once it started to look like, particularly since the last, presidential election and some other important events that have happened both in the US and in some other Western countries, once it started to look like, in recent months especially, that wokeism is really on the way out, the Neo-Neocons switched gears and started talking less and less about opposing wokeness and more about, the real problem right now is that within the American right wing, there's all these crazy extremists who think stuff like, maybe we shouldn't keep fighting wars that are at the behest of Israel, but actually in no way serve the interests of the American people in the Middle East. That the elements of the MAGA coalition that genuinely want to stop fighting wars of aggression around the world and want to bring the troops home and want the US to stop having like a zillion entangling alliances, that those people are now the real problem now that the wokies are seemingly on the decline in terms of power and influence. So very similar to the kind of character arc that a lot of the original neocons went through in the generation or two previously. The original neocons, once they got into significant positions of power and influence, they focused increasingly single-mindedly on promoting wars and trying to get the U.S. military and the U.S. taxpayer to serve, above all else, the Israeli government, and in trying to purge the American right, the conservative milieu, of any kind of anti-war libertarian or America First paleoconservative sort of Pat Buchananite elements. So the neocons jumped into the right, they sort of carpetbagged their way into conservatism, using this label of neoconservative as kind of like a disguise. They used their money and power and connections to the intelligence agency and the military-industrial complex to build influence, carpetbagged their way into the American conservative milieu, and then very quickly started trying to become the new gatekeepers and the new purgers of who's allowed to be a conservative and who's not. And the Neo-Neocons, it's the same way. Tom Woods has pointed this out publicly too in recent weeks, and I think he's dead right. That if you're someone who's, been plugged into kind of like the right-wing milieu for a while, and if you're, especially some sort of like right-wing anti-war Ron Paul libertarian, or kind of like Pat Buchanan-style paleo-conservative America Firster, and you've been part of this for a while, and you really have, read a lot of books on it, and really kind of cultivated your thinking and your beliefs for many years. And then in comes these people who, like, up until maybe a year or two ago, or at most 5 or 10 years ago, were like self-identified liberal Democrats. And here they come carpetbagging in here. They just got here, and now they're going to tell you what it means to be a conservative and who's allowed to, be a part of the conservative milieu, and who should and shouldn't be allowed to talk publicly on large platforms, and who should be allowed to post what on social media. These people are not anti-establishment. They just want to be the new establishment. They oppose the kind of progressive establishment for various reasons, but they're not against the concept of having an establishment of elitist experts who get to decide what the realm of allowable opinions are for people to have and express publicly. And in particular, they believe that they have the right to decide who is and isn't allowed to be part of American conservatism or the American right. To which I have a very similar reaction as Tom Woods, which is, fuck you. There are few things that are just more irritating and offensive than carpetbaggers, in the sense of people who come into a place, they just got here, and now suddenly they want to, tell it how it should be and force changes on it. It's kind of analogous to when Californians move to Texas or New Yorkers move to Florida and they immediately begin trying to turn their new state that they chose to move to into something that is as similar to the state that they left as possible. And to the people who already live there and like the place the way it is, and like the fact that, Florida has a culture that's very different from New York's, or that Texas has a culture and politics that's very different from California's, yeah, those people are going to get pissed off. It's like, fuck you, you just moved here. Why did you move to Texas if you didn't want to become a Texan? Why did you move to Texas if you really want to try and turn Texas into California with more humidity? So, the other things that the Neo-Neocons have in common with the earlier generation of Neocons, they are really more than anything else, their number one issue is pushing war. They're big supporters of NATO and NATO expansion. They're Russophobic, and their number one priority is, of course, being Israel first all the time, to the hilt. And there's little small details where you can see that the Neo-Neocons are just, echoes of the original Neocons dressed up in a later generation's trappings. Like, for example, both generations of Neocons worship Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. And they try to persecute as heretics and try to silence from any significant platforms anybody who has any significant disagreements with the standard hagiographical take on Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill as historical figures. But yeah, their number one priority is war hawkery and Israel first. And one of their recent innovations in the discourse that I find particularly obnoxious and irritating and wrong is their use of the term woke right to describe anti-war and anti-imperialist right-wingers. As far as I know, James Lindsay originated that term, but I've seen a number of other Neo-Neocons, including Douglas Murray and Konstantin Kisin, and maybe others that, I'm not aware of, have adopted this term and started using it a lot as a smear against anti-war America First elements of the right. This, to me, is a very clear case of projection. Whether it is conscious or unconscious, I do not know, but it's definitely projection. Because as many people have pointed out, by any objective assessment, these Neo-Neocons calling their opponents within the right the woke right, they actually are the ones who are constantly using rhetorical and media tactics that are hallmarks of the left-wing woke crazies. They're just using those exact same tactics that the woke left, are kind of defined by. They're using it instead of, for a woke racial and gender ideology or whatever. They're using it in support of their goals of war hawkery and Israel firstness. Here are just a few examples of these tactics. Smearing your opponents with toxic labels, rather than actually engaging any of their arguments substantively. Employing guilt by association, no matter how tenuous that association might be. They will often, for example, imply, and in some cases explicitly state, that there's really no difference or not much between, say, genuine anti-Semites and neo-Nazis, on the one hand, and Ron Paul-style libertarians and Pat Buchanan-style conservatives on the other. Just like the wokies, the Neo-Neocons love to use identity-based morality, where your value as a human being and their moral assessment of you is based on your kind of group identity and characteristics, and not on your actions and the consequences of your actions as an individual. And in particular, you can see it in their double standards and hypocrisy and use of special pleading when they're talking about wars between a side they have designated as good and a side they have designated as evil, and then they also lump in like all the civilians into those categories, including even, children. And so just like a crazy wokey will imply or even explicitly state that all white people are guilty and should feel guilty for the crimes of some white people in American race relations going back in history, so the Neo-Neocons will sometimes, disturbingly flippantly, minimize and justify and go into apologetic gymnastics for things like the Israeli military slaughtering civilians. All of a sudden they go into apologetics gymnastics mode of, there's this reason, there's that reason, and they're all of a sudden they're justifying why it's okay to blow up an apartment building that is full of civilians to get one suspected genuine bad guy. When of course they would never give that same justification to the other side. It's like when the side they don't like kills civilians, they rightfully call it out as a horrible thing. But when the side they have decided is the good guys, based on their identity, not based on their actions, when that side slaughters civilians, then suddenly they've got all the special pleading in the world to say why, this is actually unfortunately necessary, and really it's the other side's fault that we had to kill their kids or something like this. And it was very disturbing. If you listen to the Douglas Murray, Dave Smith episode of Joe Rogan, if you listen closely, you'll hear when Douglas Murray is talking about Hamas killing Israeli civilians, including children, he's got all this moral outrage and he's got, all this value for the lives of these civilians being killed. And then when the topic of innocent Palestinian children being killed comes up, suddenly he's very flippant, he's very callous. He clearly believes that Palestinian children have less value as human beings than Israeli children. Well, that's the wokies. That's them capitalizing the B in black people when they're writing an article and refusing to capitalize the W in white people when they're writing an article. So their morality is based on your identity group and not on your actions and the consequences of your actions. The Neo-Neocons also love to cherry-pick only evidence that supports their position, while either flat-out ignoring contrary evidence or else, if you do actually mention some potentially problematic evidence to them on some issue, they will use dismissive special pleading to wave it away without engaging in any substantive debate of what you've said. They're also prone to accusing their opponents of dog whistling. Now, the Neo-Neocons will typically not use that term because they're savvy enough to know that if they started using the term dog whistling to refer to their opponents within the American right, that people would realize, you actually sound like the wokies. And yet you're calling your opponents the woke right. That doesn't add up. So they don't usually use the term dog whistling, but that's essentially what they're doing when, for example, they'll sort of imply that someone who is opposed to America backing up Israel in its wars because they're just an America firster who doesn't think it's the U.S.'s business and that, American tax money shouldn't be funding this war on the other side of the world and, has some moral issues with what's happening in the war, that those people are no different than neo-Nazis or anti-Semitic, Hamas terrorists. The Neo-Neocons are also prone to, when they are debating or discussing something with one of their opponents, they will try to make certain things out of bounds, even if they are facts and even if they are relevant to what is being discussed or debated. And I noticed multiple examples of this in the Dave Smith-Douglas Murray debate, where, for example, when somebody, I forget if it was Dave Smith or Joe Rogan, somebody brought up or used the term neocon or neoconservative, and Douglas Murray was like, oh no, don't use that N-word. Now, in that instance, he said it with sort of a lighthearted, joking kind of a tone. But, it's one of those things, and I've heard him and other Neo-Neocons sort of do this move where they'll basically say something to the effect of, if you bring up neoconservatives or neocons as sort of like a boogeyman, that's really just a dog whistle for I hate Jews. Even if you're being very specific about certain individuals and organizations and whatever, and you're by no means saying or even implying that every Jew is in on some big neocon conspiracy. But, the fact that the guy who proudly published a book in 2007 titled Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, is now kind of saying, hey, don't bring up that word. It's the N-word. Again, yeah, he was saying it in kind of a joking tone, but he was still saying it. In addition, in the Dave Smith-Douglas Murray debate, Dave Smith at one point was talking about the neoconservatives hijacking the George W. Bush administration for their own purposes. I mean, not exactly hijacking. It's not like Bush and Cheney were, really resisting them. But anyway, kind of worming their way into that administration to make sure that it was neoconservative rather than any kind of traditional conservative. And talking about how these neocons who wormed their way into the W. Bush administration were key figures in things like the war in Iraq. Getting those conflicts going. When Dave Smith brought up the name Paul Wolfowitz, which is just a factual person who, played a major role in getting wars going 20 years ago in the Bush administration, Douglas Murray said something to the effect of, it's really irresponsible to bring up Paul Wolfowitz's name because it's a Jewish sounding last name. And if you merely mention his name as like a, bad person in recent history, as a villain, that might be interpreted by certain people as saying that it's all a global Jewish conspiracy and bloody, bloody, blah, and turning everything into anti-Semitism. So you're apparently not even allowed to bring up the facts about who were some of the people most responsible for the disastrous, evil dumpster fire that was the wars of the W. Bush administration. You're not even allowed to just talk about the facts of who were some of the key players behind that because they have Jewish last names. And if you bring up those names, you might be either purposefully or accidentally instigating a pogrom, I guess. And at one point, if memory serves, I believe Douglas Murray even did the same thing. In this case, not, I don't think, preempted by anything that Dave Smith had brought up. But at one point, in some context I can't recall, Douglas Murray also said something similar about the Rothschilds. That if anybody brings up the fact that the Rothschilds are, and have been for centuries, some of the wealthiest and most powerful financiers on the planet, and that they use a lot of that wealth to, influence politics in many countries around the world, which is just a fact, that if you even bring this up or point it out or mention it, you must be, like some hardcore neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. So again, you're just not allowed to bring up facts, because the Neo-Neocons have decided that those particular facts are malinformation. Just like the wokies had their huge list of facts that you were not allowed to bring up in conversation, because merely to bring them up revealed that you were some sort of a closet Klansman. So yeah, there's Douglas Murray behaving just like a finger-wagging, scolding wokeista, saying that Dave Smith should have self-censored from even mentioning Paul Wolfowitz's name or any other Jewish neocon's last name. Because accurately stating who these people are, even if you're not bringing up anything about, implying that this is some sort of conspiracy of all Jews or something like this, but merely just to bring up the history of who these people are and what they did, and to, name them. That might cause someone who hears Dave Smith bring this up to conclude that because Wolfowitz is a Jewish last name, therefore all Jews are part of some conspiracy that's behind every bad thing that happens in the world. And if you mention the name Rothschild, no matter how factually accurately, you must be a crazed anti-Semite. And never mind the fact that just objectively, factually speaking, the Rothschilds actually are one of the oldest, wealthiest, most powerful banking families in the entire world and have been for centuries, and that they clearly use their wealth and influence to try to steer the world in the ways that they want it to go. Also, by the way, never mind the fact that there are plenty of non-Jewish banking families and individuals who are on that same level too, who we could also bring up and name. But, if you do that, the Neo-Neocons don't care. So yeah, just like the wokies, they want to smear, silence, censor, gatekeep, and purge anyone who disagrees with them, no matter the nature of their disagreement, no matter how much nuance their argument might have, no matter how much facts and evidence they might have to cite, no matter how much they're noticeably not actually veering off into any, anti-Semitic tropes or whatever, and are merely just describing the actual history of, who some of these people are and what they've been up to. You're smeared and they want to censor you. Suddenly they want you to trust the experts. Suddenly they want there to be guardrails. Suddenly they want people to be deplatformed. So whether consciously or unconsciously, this is definitely projection. And as the saying goes, every projection is a confession. Oh, I forgot to mention before, another amusing way in which the Neo-Neocons are basically just, carbon copies in a different generation's clothes of the original Neocons is that just like the original Neocons, the Neo-Neocons, at least all of the prominent ones that I know of and have, looked into their background a little bit, all the Neo-Neocons are chicken hawks. They're people who are some of the loudest voices calling for war all the time, and yet they've never served in the military. They've never fought in any of the wars that they have helped to propagandize for, but they're always the first and the loudest voices explaining why other people's kids should go fight and die in their wars. Most of the Neo-Neocons, just like most of the original Neocons, I don't think have ever even been in anything as difficult as a schoolyard brawl. I know James Lindsay had said on Joe Rogan that he trains jujitsu. Maybe that's true. Fine. Good for him. But, I'm pretty sure Ben Shapiro never got into a schoolyard brawl. I'm pretty sure that if anybody ever pushed him on the playground, he probably went crying to the authority figures and probably had his mommy come in and threaten the school with a lawsuit if they didn't protect their little boy from such rough behavior. The Neo-Neocons don't really want free and open and uncensored discourse. They don't want there to be no gatekeepers. And they don't really want our thoroughly corrupt and discredited institutions to die. Now, they're critical of these institutions, but really, they just want some personnel and ideology changes in them. They don't want these institutions of control to go away. The Neo-Neocons will often look back to some mythical time, ranging from maybe just a couple of decades ago to as far back as 60 or 70 years ago, when they believe and they portray that the institutions and the gatekeepers of our society here in the United States were supposedly not corrupt and were totally truthful and objective, and, you used to be able to trust the news, and academia didn't used to be crazy. They used to just teach you the facts. And, they have these kind of golden age narratives about most of these institutions that are just bullshit. It's not that the American media and academia and so forth of 60, 70 years ago were not extremely biased and propagandistic and controlled, etc. It's just that for a variety of reasons, it was less obvious at the time. The main ones being there wasn't something like the internet and social media and alternative media that could allow dissenting voices to be heard and potentially gain a large following. And there's other reasons too. I think that previous generations of our establishment institutions were better at pretending to be objective and fair and so forth. So it's not like Bohemian Grove member Walter Cronkite was actually trustworthy and honest and didn't have any kind of agenda. It's just that he was better and more serious about, when he's in front of the camera, doing everything he can to not appear to have any kind of agenda. Because after all, the best propaganda is always that propaganda which does not appear to most people to be propaganda. But what are the Neo-Neocons up to? Well, more than anything else, they're up to war. The biggest priorities to them are wars and promoting the American empire and putting what they believe are the interests of Israel first, second, third, and fourth, and, maybe America fifth, if there's time permitting. And really, that's what a lot of this talk about, we need to suddenly not have free speech and we need to suddenly have guardrails and, kind of soft, not so obvious censorship and all the things that they were, criticizing strongly and correctly 6 months ago. It's because they know that free speech might eventually result in a lot more people becoming anti-war and skeptical of the American empire and skeptical of America's relationship with Israel. They're for free speech when the people who are being censored are just people who are criticizing wokeness. But if the people being censored are critics of American wars and of the relationship between the U.S. and Israeli governments, if those are the people being censored, they're all for it. If you don't believe me, here is an audio clip from Alex Karp. Alex Karp I would also consider a Neo-Neocon, although he's less of a media personality and he is a businessman in the military-industrial complex. He's the CEO of Palantir. And here's a little segment of him explaining why he supported efforts in the United States to ban TikTok. And he basically said it's because a lot of young people are on TikTok and they're seeing too much of what the Israeli war against the Palestinians actually looks like, and this is causing them to be anti-war and America supporting Israel in this war. But don't take my word for it, take his.
Palantir CEO Alex Karp never one to hold back. He has now been calling out corporate America for its silence following Hamas's attack on Israel October 7th. Here's what we had to say yesterday in Washington about the protests across college campuses and potentially hiring from them as well.
Of course, I've been calling out the thin, corrosive, cancerous ideology that regresses below Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and any form of Western thought that is now a pagan religion infecting our universities, because it's dangerous to America.
We kind of just think these things that are happening across college campuses especially are like a sideshow. No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever.
That's right.
So that's really what it's all about. And by the way, I haven't had time to really dig into the details, but at this point, it looks to me like most likely Palantir, which is also connected to Peter Thiel and through that to the Trump administration in various ways. It looks like Palantir is probably in some way connected to and is perhaps a corporate donor to the Manhattan Institute. But again, I haven't really dug into that much at this point, so, I can't comment beyond that other than it looks like there's a significant connection that probably includes funding. So yeah, the Neo-Neocons, they were fine with alternative media attacking wokeism. They were fine with alternative media questioning many aspects of the COVID regime. Although, by the way, I should note, many of the Neo-Neocons were on board with a lot of the COVID regime stuff for noticeably longer than most libertarians, paleoconservatives, and sort of anti-establishment leftists, Jimmy Dore types. A lot of these Neo-Neocons were a little bit late. They were fine with alternative media attacking Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris because they supported Trump. And at this point, I'm very much convinced that the primary reason for the Neo-Neocon support of Trump is that they believe, and they seem to be right, that Trump is a hardcore Zionist. And while Trump does have a lot of anti-war, America First rhetoric, and perhaps even a fair amount of instincts in that regard, it's really not that hard to manipulate him into being belligerent against countries that he sort of has a natural antipathy toward, such as Iran or China. And it's also not that hard to manipulate him into belligerence and betraying the whole idea of America first on the behalf of Israel. But as soon as the battles against wokeness appeared to be beginning to be won, the Neo-Neocons suddenly switched gears, and they immediately started trying to purge the current American right of any anti-war, anti-imperialist, America first, libertarian, and paleoconservative elements. This is eerily similar to what neocon fellow traveler Bill Buckley and a lot of the original early neocons did to the American right in the 1950s and 60s, where they tried and were pretty effective overall at purging the quote-unquote respectable right of any elements that were not on board for the neocon agenda of perpetual warfare around the world, and a lot of it being done on the behalf of the Israeli government. So in my opinion, right now, at the moment, given the political constellations of power that exist in the aftermath of Trump's victory last November, I think a strong case could be made that if you're any kind of an anti-war, anti-establishment, America First type person, some sort of libertarian or Pat Buchanan-ish conservative, or even, a principled anti-war, pro-civil liberties leftist Jimmy Dore type. Right now, the most important thing might be opposing the Neo-Neocons in any way possible. Because the wokies, they're not gone, but they're kind of on the back foot and on the decline at the moment. And right now, if you're someone who's not on board for constant wars all the time, and Israel first, and the American empire, and censorship, and gatekeeping, and purging people whose opinions you don't like and you don't want to actually debate, that these Neo-Neocons, if they win, and if they completely take over and co-opt the sort of MAGA America First movement in the way that the original neocons successfully co-opted and hijacked previous kind of grassroots, genuinely conservative American movements. If they're successful, the consequences could be disastrous. If they're able to get their way and completely take over the post-Trump American right, I hate to say it, but some of us who are anti-war libertarians and conservatives might eventually get to a point where we'll decide, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris might have been the lesser evils, as much as we might not want to admit it. Because if the Neo-Neocons get everything they want, they're going to make the United States as much of an authoritarian country as the woke lefties were in the process of making it when they were in the dominant position. With the added horrific bonus that they might spark World War III. So don't be fooled. We don't want the Neo-Neocons smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.